Good evening, everybody. How y'all feeling? It's been a glorious day, I can tell. And if you're able, I would invite you all, if you feel comfortable moving up a bit. We wanted to have an intimate conversation, something along the lines of what it means to talk about these issues in a real way, in an intimate way, as if we were at home, at our kitchen table, or in our living rooms. And we want to ask tough questions with our panelists here today who are going to think about how we might together reimagine, deconstruct, raise masculinity, and think about how we can be free, liberated, loving men in our communities, in our home, and in the world. So we want to jump right in. At some point, let me ask this. Are y'all comfortable if we ask you a question talking back to us? Yes. Are you comfortable if we ask a question, you talking to one another? Because what we don't want to do is be up here as if we're experts. We're all learning together. So we want to invite you to be part of the conversation. If you're good with that and you're able to, give me 2 snaps. All right, cool. So we're joined by Preston, Mitchum, Jamil Smith, Milan, and Mychal Denzel Smith. You all should know their work. They're doing fantastic things in the world. I won't go through their bios because they're in the playbill, but let's jump in. Simple question. How did you learn? Who taught you? What signs were you given to become the boys, the men who you were and who you are today? Who taught you that?
Are you looking at me? Well, I wrote a whole book about that. I think a lot of my education around how to be a man, be a black boy, black man in the world happened through consumption of culture. It happened through music, it happened through film, it happened through television. These were the figures that I wanted to emulate. These are the figures that spoke directly to me, that had some type of message that meant something to my understanding of the world. So it was, very early on, I was born in 1986, so like early on, 5 or 6 years old, it's like Dr. Dre and Snoop are speaking to me, and Tupac and Biggie. Later, it's like Jay-Z, and then later it's Mos Def and Common and The Roots, and Spike Lee was teaching me. So those are the sort of messaging that I was receiving. Those are the messengers, and I didn't. Until sitting down to write the book, I didn't even really
And tell us the name of the book, by the way.
It's Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching. Until writing the book, I didn't really analyze what the messages were, what exactly they were trying to convey about what it means to be a black man in the world. But so much of it, upon that reflection, I realized how much unlearning was necessary because of how steeped in male dominance so many of those messages were.
And I hope we're picking this up, this idea that sometimes we won't even know until much later on the messages that we've been taught and how they've shaped our behavior. Teak.
Yeah, so I'm transgender. So I'm female to male. I came into this world a girl. I had a girlhood. I was somebody's daughter. So for me growing up, what I learned about boys and boyhood was I learned that boys were free and boys were dangerous at the same time, and that for me as a little girl, for me to even express any semblance of that same freedom as little boys put me in their danger. Put me in harm's way. So I grew up having that feeling and still feeling very masculine inside and not understanding why I didn't have the freedom in my body and in my heart to still move like the boys in my neighborhood did. Just little things like watching them go and be able to ride their bikes all over the neighborhood, and they wanted me to stay on the porch and chill out, and I wanted to be free in my body and athletic in my body, And, similar to Mychal, growing up, I was a hip hop head for real, and got a lot of messages about masculinity, but it wasn't until I came into my manhood, into my trans masculinity, that I started to really look at those messages about manhood and masculinity and understand that it was really antithetical to what I thought that my masculinity was in my mind, in the man that I wanted to be. All the messages I was getting was something that I had to quickly take in and quickly had to push aside, because it caused a lot of conflict within me, emotionally and spiritually. So even now today, I started my transition, my medical legal transition 10 years ago, but I'm still on this journey of figuring out what exactly it means to be a black man in this world, what it means for me to be a man for women and feminine people and not so concerned about being a man for other men, and what that looks like. So for me, it's still a constant journey of learning and unlearning.
Thank you. Jamil.
Well, for me, I went to private school growing up, and a lot of my conceptions of manhood were, based in my conceptions of race. And so being basically the only black man in a lot of my classrooms, they're, basically learning how to essentially assert my own individuality, and also learning how self-reliance, learning that I'm not going to be taught I'm not going to be taught about black manhood in my classroom. I'm not going to be reading books by black men in my classroom. I'm going to have to do that on my own. And thankfully, my parents were very supportive in that fact. Also, my father. My father was very conscious of his, I guess you could say, his underlying feminism. He was never one of these people who would, be out there saying, I'm a feminist, I'm for women's rights. But he manifested those beliefs in his behavior and the way he treats women, and he still does today. So I learned a lot of lessons from him. And then also, I'd say a lot of it, because I had to learn how to read, for myself about what it was to be a black man, both now and before, I'd say, authors like Ralph Ellison were instrumental in my formation of what it meant to be a black man in a world that doesn't necessarily value me.
Thanks. And Preston, one of the things I also want to note is it's interesting you can have a panel full of black male-identified people. And what we're hearing is that our experience is not all the same, and that instead of us talking about masculinity as if it's like a universal thing, now our masculinity is plural. And we should be, and by the way, y'all can talk back. I don't know what happened in this, I'm gonna talk like this at church. I grew up in a church. I don't know what happened before we got here. But you can snap when you hear something affirming. You can give an affirming snap, or I hear you, brother. If there's something that you want to challenge, you can give us a little wink. But we want to have and be in a conversation, and we want to wake the spirit of this room up, because we're up here talking about liberation, and now we can have cis and trans brothers of variously identified sexual means, variously identified gender expressions. Talk, that's some liberating, I was about to cuss, but I'm in church, stuff. So I want to celebrate the fact that we can model what it means to have tough conversations like this, even though we're all from different aspects of life, even though we all live our lives quite differently in terms of how we orient ourselves, and it's a freeing thing to see. So talk back to the brothers if you want to. Preston.
Good evening, everyone. Thank y'all. So as a black gay man on National Coming Out Day, it's an honor to be before you all. Officially came out 9 years ago, so I definitely want to offer that into this space. What I also want to offer into this space is how difficult this conversation honestly is for me as someone who grew up resenting black men. And resenting in the multiplicities of what it means to resent black men from a variety of angles. So as growing up in Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, I don't know if you know about it, but look it up. So one thing about Youngstown, Ohio is just this overly masculine, dominated environment that I kind of found myself in often. And growing up non-masculine dominating, it was very difficult for me to kind of readjust what masculinity and boyhood meant for me. So for me, I will say that if you ask me what I think about boyhood, if you had asked me then, I would have easily given you the most disgusting response, right? But challenging myself and interrogating myself about what boyhood means and why I thought a certain way, it becomes a little bit conflicting for me. So my mom was always very positive about black men, despite the black men who did her wrong. And so it really taught me the power of black women at that time, who really kind of pulled themselves back just for the kind of uplifting other people who kind of didn't treat them respectfully. And so boyhood meant a lot to me, even though I felt it was taken away oftentimes. So I'll tell a little story, and it's one that's tough to retell, but I'm a childhood sexual assault survivor from 2 years from my mom's second husband. So for me, what it meant to be a boy was very difficult especially as someone who had conflicts with identifying as gay as a young child. So it was very tough for me to really figure out, am I gay? Am I actually enjoying the experiences that are being forced onto me? And so that's a conversation I don't think we have often enough. And so part of what boyhood meant to me meant you couldn't hang around girls, despite me mostly having women family members. It meant that my uncle, the only older male adult who I had looked up to at the time, thought being a man meant toughing me up by punching me several times. And so so what I don't want is sympathy or pity, right? Because I'm a great individual. So I appreciate the affirmation, but what I don't want to hear from this is pity and sympathy, right? Because I've lived my life as you all are living yours. But it did challenge me a lot to really identify what boyhood and masculinity and manhood meant, and to the point where now I understand that it's nuanced, though complicated. There is an intersection of this freedom and danger that people kind of perceive from black manhood and masculinity. And so I am so ready for this conversation.
Thank you. I want to move on to this notion of consent. And this is a word that may sound really fancy, but how did you all learn about boundaries? That the body of someone else isn't property, or maybe this is what you learned. But how did did y'all ever hear the word consent? Did anybody ever say that word when you were growing up?
No.
Never.
No. Nope.
Okay. And then, so if now as adults you understand that to mean that there being a mutual agreement between you and another, whether that's a sexual intimate partner or anyone else, to either engage their space, their body, their persona. When did you learn that lesson, and who taught you? And anybody can feel free to jump in, and we have limited time, so come on, snap.
When I tried to kiss a girl in the 8th grade dance and she turned away. And it felt like, oh gosh, wait a minute, is this about me? Does my breath stink? And then I realized that no, she just doesn't want you, fool. And you didn't ask to kiss her. And this is thing, I mean, you're 12 years old. You learn these lessons sometimes in safer ways than a lot of other people learn these lessons. But that's honestly when I learned it. It's when I first started thinking about, hey, maybe this is something that needs to be a two-way conversation.
For me, growing up, as a trans kid, and as a little girl having a girlhood, it was just, keep your legs closed. It was always, the onus was always on me to set the boundaries when it came to like sexual advances and things like that. And if somebody, didn't respect those boundaries, then it was probably my fault, and that was instilled in me at a very, very young age, and now thinking back at it as a trans kid, I wasn't really sexualized then. I didn't really understand what sexuality was or sex and none of those things, but I knew what was being told to me felt wrong. You know what I'm saying? It didn't feel right in my spirit. But from very early on, I learned that when it came to consent, it was really, all of the responsibility fell on the girl. And this idea that boys will be boys, and you just have to kind of like navigate yourself through this idea, through this unaccountableness of boys will be boys.
Yeah, to sort of echo what Tika's saying, I think there was always two understandings, that there was the official line about not touching anybody that doesn't want to be touched, right? But then there was the other mode of understanding in which you are a young boy, so the expression of like your desires takes precedent over that, right? And so when you are out there on the playground, as I was like pulling hair and grabbing girls and all of that, that's just boys being boys. That's the expression, like you're expressing your attraction to them. And that continues later on to the point that you're allowed to do whatever you want up until the point that the girl says no, right? Like that was the understanding, is that, yes, you're not supposed to touch anyone that doesn't want to be touched in sort of a masculine sense, right? Like that's going to lead to a fight. But with women, with girls, all the messaging is you do whatever you want up until the point that she registers the no. And even after that, you're supposed to be looking for cues that she maybe actually really wanted you to, right? Like if she's laughing after the fact, if she still continues to flirt with you later, like she continues to talk to you, like those are signs that, oh no, she actually doesn't mind it, you know? So there's just two modes of understanding with that I was privy to. And I don't know what moment, I don't know if there's an exact moment of understanding that those things are in conflict with one another. But it was later. It was not like, I was not 12, you know, I was probably 18, 19 years old when like that understanding really came. And I think it was more so an observation of like college parties and the way in which you were asked to dance, right? Like in the way in which a boy was charged with asking a girl to dance. And all you do is walk up behind her, right? Like that's the extent of the asking to dance, right?
Why y'all act like y'all know something about that?
And I think watching that, it was like, you have no idea who is coming up behind you right now. You have no idea whether or not you want to engage this person, but they have demanded that you make the decision right now. Like that, and I think that's the moment, those are the moments where it sort of collapses for me, and the understanding is everyone has a right to their own bodies.
Thank you.
So from a very physical sense, I learned about consent, probably too young. But in a very theoretical sense, I think I can honestly say I learned about consent through black women on social media. And so part of those conversations with Jamil Lemieux, Feminist the Jones, Trudy, et cetera, kind of really started to develop what it meant about street harassment and consent and the notion of black men in this context feeling kind of, I have the right to your body. I have the right to speak to you. You better speak back to me, or else I never wanted you in the first place, which kind of defeats the purpose of me talking to you in the first place. But whatever. So that aside, that's what I can honestly say. Theoretically, I started to really think about what consent meant, who the onus was on. And it's funny that we're actually talking about consent and black masculinity in the context of movies that premiered this past weekend, and something that, you know, may be a little difficult of a conversation to have, but rape and Nate Parker seem to have been going into a lot of sentences in the past month. So I want to offer that. And that's something to have a difficult conversation on, but I think it's still part and parcel really overlays the context of this conversation.
And I appreciate you opening up space for us to think about this. My question to you in the audience is, when did you learn, did anyone ever say the word consent or teach you about consent? Did that ever come up in the spaces you were in your, whatever that could be, your home? And then what was a moment for which that became something that was very real to you, to the extent that you're willing to share that? Do you mind talking to someone that you feel a sort of safe energy to in a space as safe as that could be? And I'm not asking you to share stories that require you to guard yourself here. We don't really know each other. What I'm asking is, how did you come to know consent? Maybe it's something you never learned. Maybe you just heard it today. And if you can talk, maybe in groups of 2 or 3, really quick for about 3 minutes about that, if you feel comfortable, and then we'll return to the conversation. Is that cool? If you're cool with that, say, ow. All right, cool. Get to it. I'm timing you. 3 minutes. Go for it. Exactly. So that's what we're going to bring up. And I want you all to attention. Yeah. And it isn't only about male domination towards women, because consent is something that needs to be practiced and fails to be practiced within same-sex relationships.
Even our relationships.
Yes.
Grabbing up and hugging up on kids.
The role models that are set for it. I mean, I remember, like, you know, sports models as a kid. You know, see how athletes dealt with it. Or at least public. A lot of times, you know,
Go get someone for a kiss.
but yo,
I had my cousin Mandy was an athlete.
I never had that's my love.
And you couldn't say no, but you couldn't say no.
I think it's a matter of like respecting your elders.
Yeah, I mean, even my dog show, would you like a hug? Would you like, because I want to, I want them to know that somebody should ask you first before they put their hands on you, before they put their arms on you.
Right? So, and that makes sense.
Because they'll take the affection that you need as a adult from them. The second time. Yeah, you're supposed to take care of them. Yeah.
We got like
Bring it to the
I'm really from Buffalo. I've been in New York City.
Is that when you were a teenager?
Buffalo, as soon as I finished my grad. So my whole adult life.
Yeah, after college, pretty much. Conversation with the teacher about what happened on Facebook. She didn't scold me about it. She was just like, you understand what happened? She didn't make me feel bad about it. She just was like, you understand that you have to take responsibility. You know what I mean? You have to I was like, also focus for me.
We have 10 seconds.
And I thought that was romantic.
I'm sorry, what was my?
As a transgender male, what was your consent? Like, how did you find out your consent?
Okay. So, we are at time.
Yeah.
I did want to give one or two people in the audience an opportunity to maybe reflect on what came out of your conversation for about 30 to 45 seconds. We will have time to open up for questions, but does someone have a thought or question in the audience? I think I saw a hand. Go for it.
Go for it. Go ahead.
My name's Tom. I have a question for you. The one in the middle.
Yes.
T.
I have a question, just out of curiosity. As someone who's went through womanhood and also manhood in the same life, I have a question like, have you ever encountered the double standards? Have you ever witnessed them? Or maybe to reflect like, wait a minute, I'm looking at these double standards that they had against women. When I was a girl, I didn't notice it until now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
You want to repeat that?
Yeah, so the question was, have I, now that as a trans man, have I encountered double standards and what that looks like? Yes. Every day, every day I see that the double standard that exists in the world, and I think oftentimes, I've had conversations with black men where we pretend like black male privilege doesn't exist because we're black, right? Which is categorically untrue. There's a lot of privilege in being a man, whether you are a black man or not, Like, for instance, I have the privilege of getting on New York City subway train at 2 a.m. and don't have to worry about being sexually assaulted at all. You know what I'm saying? I'm on the train at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's nothing but men on this train because women know that even at that time of night, they can't be on that train because men are so vicious. You know what I'm saying? I think as a trans man and walking in the world as a man, I think I'm more privy to different conversations. I'm starting to really understand how rape culture exists and how the violence that is perpetuated against women is something that is just it's just in our culture. It's fluid as water. You know what I'm saying? It's just in the fabric of our culture. And as I grow as a man and as a human being, and part of me being a trans man has been about me interrogating masculinity. And I don't think anybody needs to have a transgender experience to interrogate masculinity and to really try to hold themselves accountable to the bullshit that's happening in the world. So for me, it's a process, and every day I'm pushing up against that, and having to check myself and check other people. So it's definitely something that I have definitely seen in my life, and I'm constantly challenged by.
Before we move on to the other question, I did want to raise this point about, I think when we talk about consent, we're easily thinking about what it means for male-identified people to engage in mutually agreeable ways with women. But sexism and the rudiments of patriarchy and male domination and power work themselves out in all types of relationships. Whether it's two men, a man and a woman, that's just foundational to sort of the notion of manhood, as we come to know it. And Preston, we talked about a bit about this up here, but talk a bit about what this looks like within queer communities as well.
Wow, thank you for bringing that up. Something that's often, I do think, undiscussed, or even like consent, intimate partner violence as it looks in queer spaces. So it's a fantastic point. So as someone who goes to the club literally 2 or 3 times a week, y'all
know who to go. You know who to ask where the party at after this, right?
So, which is quite funny because most people don't expect it. But I'm out in these streets often, and I think part of that allows me to sit back and look at how consent or lack thereof plays out in queer spaces, especially in gay and queer clubs, especially in white-dominated queer clubs where black and brown bodies exist. So there's a bar here called Nellie's that exists on 9th and U Street, and it's one of the first, I've been living here now for 5 years, and it's one of the first places in DC that I've gone to where I noticed the kind of the intersections of race and sex and consent play out. And just literally, like, it's funny when I hear Michael tell the story about like walking up to behind a woman as you're like in school, and as someone who was perceived, because I am a man, to be straight when I was younger, it was just this assumption that you're a man, you're straight, naturally, whatever. So I'm gonna teach you the same way that I taught everyone else, which was very conflicting for me because I'm like, okay, whatever. So now that I think about it, it's still the same things happening in the clubs. It is still men walking up behind men, literally forcibly, it's okay, let it out. Forcibly, like, dancing, not asking permission. And I know it probably seems odd, because you're kind of in your groove, and you're like, hey, you want to, okay, I'm just trying to dance. You know what I mean? So it always plays out like that. So I say all that in joke, in jest, but seriousness, that when we think about consent, I do think we have to explore what that means beyond heterosexual identified spaces, because sexism plays out the same way that it plays out in our spaces. We can have difficult conversations about everything else that may be a little bit past PG-13, but just know that generally speaking, consent happens, or lack thereof happens in all spaces.
And I also want to note a sort of not only a disrespect, but often like this sort of hatred of the feminine, which is embedded in sexist culture, where it isn't necessarily a woman-identified person, in as much, because femme-identified men, are men who identify as men, who are also femme-performing, can get on that same train as you and experience just as much of lack of safety as somebody else. So that's something I want us to also think through. I want to move along. It's easy for us to point the finger at like obvious bad guys, right? We can all day talk about the people who have been charged or got off for sexual assault, people who have committed intimate partner violence. It's very easy to do that because, it's easy to, point out, should I give names like Donald Trump? But like, that's too obvious. But, you brought up Nate Parker. But what it isn't easy to do is to also think about the ways we as men are complicit in creating the context for sexual assault, power domination, intimate partner violence, and a range of other things to happen. Even if we ourselves did not commit that action, we sustain, we uphold, we make possible a culture that allows those things to happen. But we'll get up here and we'll go, but that's the bad dude over there. And they may be. But then we have to be self-reflexive, turn a mirror on ourselves, and understand how we contribute to that. Talk to me about your process. How do you, what brings you to self-reflection? Who taught you? Like for me, self-reflection came through reading the work of black feminists. Black women feminists, mostly black lesbian feminists like Cheryl Clark and Barbara Smith, and reading Homegirls and all of these, the Combahee River Collective, right? They taught me, but how did you come to know that self-reflection would be something that would free you up and teach you about yourself? And what do you do to self-reflect?
You taught me. No, I mean, that's real though. Like so much of the process, and again, not to come back to it, but like what I was working through in the book was things that I'd heard you say and heard you go through it, the working through that in a public sphere. And in an understanding, like, so yes, it's easy to point the finger and say those are the bad guys, but like what we want then is a conception of ourselves as good. And I think that's a useless concept. I think that we ourselves, we want to self-mythologize, right? And we want to believe that all of our influences must be correct because we ourselves can't come to believe that we are incorrect in any way. And so in that desire, what we do is we rationalize and we justify our behavior and our language because we learned it from someone else that we admire and that we don't want to tear down. But the reality is when Donald Trump says that's locker room talk, right? If that's locker room talk, who is in the room with him allowing that sort of language to fly, right?
That was a word. That was a word.
So,
get that word. You got that word?
So if no one has checked him, then how if you haven't spoken up to check him on that quote unquote locker room talk, how do you conceive of yourself as a good person? Right? And so when you're willing to do that work, when someone has shown you why it's necessary to do that work, because understanding the complicity within systems of oppression is the only way we dismantle them, because it has to be the people with the power and the privilege willing to live without it, willing to let it go for these systems to finally fall. So the question then is not whether or not you are good. The question is whether or not you're willing to do the work to free others.
Thank you.
For me, like you, I was taught a lot by, black feminists, black lesbian feminists who I got to read, growing up. But I think who taught me most was my wife, really, being married to such an amazing, beautiful black woman who is so self-aware and is so just open and honest, even when it's terrifying for her, is really open and honest about what consent looks like, what her day-to-day life is like every day, having to navigate every day when she gets up in the morning, she has to think harder about what she's going to wear so that she could just walk through the world as an anonymous person, talking to her about how, she's a joyous and beautiful person and she want to be able to smile and say what's up to the brothers and be, and kiki, but she can't, she has to have her resting bitch face on all the time, right? And then, so now there's this conflict, right? So now she's this angry black woman, she's just trying to be safe, And so learning about that and thinking about it now as a trans man, and as I always say, it's like becoming a man of my own design and understanding the tropes of masculinity that I want to engage in and those that I don't, I've really taken her lead, and there's just this mythology of the good guy, all the guys in the locker room, but that's not me, or all these sisters getting harassed on the streets, but that's not me. Well, then who is he, And what I didn't want to do as I'm coming into my manhood, as a consistent kind of journey, is start to recreate that system of the good and the bad guy within my queer community, within my trans identity, right? So for me, it's important for me to completely rethink what black masculinity is, and for my manhood to be something that's more tethered to my relationship to the feminine in my life than as opposed to competing with the masculine energies in men in my life.
Thank you.
For me, a lot of it comes out of journalism. As a journalist, I am basically paid to learn. And so it's one of the wonderful trades in that regard. So I look at it as a way to continue to remain open to a lot of different truths, a lot of different perspectives. So one of those truths is that I don't get it right all the time. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that as we're learning, as we're taking information, as we're gaining, a new sense of what is feminism, what are feminisms as, plural, we need to make sure that we remain open to hear people who actually know what they're talking about tell us what their life, what their experience is, what their perspective is. And so that's one of the things I learned through my trade, and I think that it's applicable to anybody. You don't have to be a journalist to listen. You have to be a journalist to make sure that as a man you give women the space to shine when they haven't previously been given that space. Make sure that you listen, make sure that you stay aware, and make sure that when you do mess up, you're willing to admit where that you were wrong and willing to learn from it.
So for me, probably odd answer, but for me, I learned a lot of this through law school. in a very odd way. So I went to HBCU Law School, North Carolina Central University, and yes, and part of what I learned was I needed to learn everything immediately after I learned it. And so I think what was difficult about me, especially in classes like criminal law, learning about rape, was just how many times people were found not guilty for things that were just so like, wow, like I cannot believe we actually had a jury of these people to decide that this person was not guilty. And it's hard for me as a naturally defense-oriented person, but also as a survivor. So I think for me, I learned a lot about just masculinity and the way it plays in the context of law. Some years back, about 8 years ago. Also black feminists, particularly black lesbian women and black trans women who told me that I was wrong a lot, because I needed to hear that a lot. Growing up, I read so many things, but what I started to do in a very unfortunate way was speak for people as opposed to having them share their experiences themselves. So I think for me that became very noticeable, just through me wanting to be the protector, as masculinity says you're supposed to be, of black women who are being wronged by a lot of toxic masculinity while still silencing them in that process, which means I'm doing the same thing that I'm accusing someone of doing. So I think a lot of it was really learning 2 very valuable words, shut up, and another very valuable word, listen. And then letting someone speak for themselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you. They were good, right? Amazing. We're coming to a close, and this has been so good. I thought we were gonna, I literally, before we got on stage, I'm like, we're gonna talk for 20 minutes because it's running over, and we're gonna bounce. And now I'm up here like, I wish we had much more time, but I think we need to commit time to thinking through a lot and having these hard conversations. I'll end by inviting you all to reflect on what freedom looks like, what it feels like. And I'll begin and I'll add, I'll contribute a bit here. I just lost my father 2 weeks ago. And while the heaviness of his passing has been something I've been working through, I have learned so many lessons. This was a man for whom I had a really complicated relationship with because of how I came to understand manhood and masculinity through his actions. I watched him beat my mom. I watched him also be the loving and kind father who taught his little boy how to wash for the first time. So I had these conflicting ideas about who he was until I stood there and watched him on his deathbed and thought about this boy's world. He had me at 15 in Camden, New Jersey. And it came to me, who taught this black boy how to bring up another black boy? And when I had to think about the answers, the streets, the TV he watched, the various means for which he came and thought he needed to be a father, it gave me so much empathy for him. And the dad that I had pointed my finger at, I had to turn and look at that same person inside myself and realize that we were of the same blood, the same skin, the same bone, and I was no better than him. That I commit every day and I'm complicit in so many of the things I have dogged him out for. And I was able to send him off in peace. Now, part of what I see as liberating and freedom is actually being bold enough to funeralize everything I have been taught about manhood, about masculinity. I'm not even sure I want to hold on to that shit anymore. Masculinity, I don't know. It could be redemptive. And I don't think that toxic masculinity, that all aspects of any of our masculinities, our femininities are all toxic. But I do believe, and I want to honor that, right? That for me, what it means to be liberating is to exist in the world where however I'm existing is bringing forth safety, generosity and care, and ethics of compassion for the people around me, irregardless of their lot, of their gender, of their connection to me, of my intimate relationship. I don't have power to dominate anybody's life in that way. So what do you think?
Right there. I think that's it. I think that's a word.
No, but I want us to also dream together. What does it mean to be loving, liberated human beings, men, masculine, however, feminine, non-gender identified, like whatever, living in a world in a way that all of our people can be free and safe?
I mean, obviously we all echo what you just shared. I guess I don't know what it feels like to be free. What I can say is that, this may be like the cynic in me. I don't think I will feel that within my lifetime. What I hope, though, is that I'm working in this life toward a world in which someone somewhere down the line knows that feeling.
Yeah. I think masculinity needs a revision. It doesn't necessarily need to be trashed. And I think that when we trash masculinity and you say we reject all the things that men are, I think it's dangerous. I think it's a little bit lazy, frankly. We need to be a little bit better at critical thinking. We need to, really ask more questions about ourselves and encourage men, specifically young men, to ask about themselves, to get to know themselves better before they end up, wait a minute, all of a sudden I'm 18 and I don't really know myself and my identity has been formed by other forces, which some have been malevolent, some have been not, but I don't really know who I am. We need young men to know themselves earlier so that they can be, I think, more functionary in the world.
Thank you.
So I certainly agree. I think masculinity must be reimagined, not thrown away. And I think we often have to interrogate why we think masculinity by itself is such a dangerous thing. Because I don't think masculinity by itself is a bad thing. There's a lot of factors, there's societal influence behind that contributes to why we think that. But masculinity by itself is I view my mom as masculine. My mom is very strong and powerful and has a lot of what we perceive to be male traits. But a lot of women that we know hold those very masculine traits that kind of lift us up every day. So what I will say about how I envision freedom, I think about it every day through the work that we do on BYP 100. And the way I kind of really think about that is perpetual joy of black people, right? The fact that I can really sit back and think about anyone in the black ancestral spirits, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, et cetera, and really think about how they're viewing us from above. And the way I also think about freedom and liberation is the feeling that you get when you meet someone for the first time who you know you're probably going to fall in love with. So that's kind of how I view freedom and liberation, and that's really what I'm working toward every day.
Thank you.
I echo everything that everyone's saying. I think masculinity is definitely something that has to be reimagined. And for me, a lot of freedom comes with understanding that, no one owns the patent on masculinity. It's not a monolithic experience. It's a plurality. Masculinity is a real thing. And this is something that I've learned through queer liberation. And I always say, straight folks need some queer liberation too. You know what I'm saying? For us to understand that, masculinity, it doesn't just look one way. It doesn't belong to a specific gender. And I think, for me, being in that space and moving through that space and still learning has given me a lot of freedom. I mean, there's a lot of places where I'm oppressed, where I'm saying, we see what's happening in the world, right? But there are places in my heart that are very free, and that freedom comes from the liberation that my queer community has offered me to live in the space that I'm in now.
And with that, thank you, Teague. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jamil. Thank you, Preston. Thank you all.
You, Darnell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Darnell.